Bridget Outtrim is a director in the industrial and logistics team at Savills with a focus on urban logistics in London and the South East. She's a thought leader in the coexistence of logistics and other uses. So Bridget, you believe that logistics should be an essential part of infrastructure planning, and with the increase in deliveries, congestion, sustainability, all issues heightened by the pandemic, these really need to be looked at. So what do you think needs to be done?
I think that the logistics and distribution sector needs to have a greater importance. It needs to be elevated up in the mindset of policymakers. I think that there's a mindset, certainly in urban locations, that I'm thinking of central London, boroughs, Greater London, in fact, whereby, there's this, everyone wants to regenerate, we want to improve the quality of areas. And there's a mindset amongst policymakers that means clearing out all the grubby industrial that nobody really wants and improving it. So it seems to be that ridding themselves of B2 and B8 uses seems to be somehow an improvement, and that's completely the wrong mindset for policymakers, because actually the industrial sector is the property sector that supports our modern lifestyles. So when we're on our sofas watching Netflix, Netflix is responsible for taking up hundreds of thousands of square feet of industrial space in our market. They need film studio space. It's one of the strongest sectors. When you're saving your family photographs on your iPhone in the cloud, the cloud is actually a warehouse. These data centers are setting themselves up. They're taking industrial land and they're building data centers to support our internet usage. So it's not just about Amazon and parcel delivery. It's not just about e-commerce. It's the whole, it encompasses all of our modern lifestyles. And when I see large regeneration projects, which involves lots of residential development, and completely understand the political pressure for residential, it's clearly essential. The B8 sector, logistics and distribution, should be seen of as being another utility provision, because young people these days who they will want to buy the flats that they're building, they expect to have gas, electricity and water, of course, reasonably so. They also expect to be able to have their Deliveroos, and they expect to be able to have their parcels arriving. They expect to be able to order their food for it to arrive when they're out. So the lifestyles of younger people needs to be accommodated in the design of buildings. And actually the B8 sector is really needed for that. I'd like to see developers thinking more about the receiving ends of parcels. It's not just about putting lockers in reception areas. There needs to be more organisation, perhaps consolidation of the receipt of deliveries, because I hear a lot about the public realm, improving public realm. Well, lots of these new developments, the occupiers are not allowed to have cars, there's no parking spaces. So they will be dialing in, they will be using their smartphones to receive goods. And that means they'll be attracting deliveries. And what you don't want is the public realm to be overrun with white vans. It's got to be organised. And that means including the logistics and distribution sector into the design of the flats, but not too much of it. So what I'm hearing from policymakers is that the no net loss, don't you have to put back the same amount that's been demolished. And actually, I think that's nonsense. If commercial space is being put into what will become residential areas, then it should be space which serves the amenity of the people that have to live there and provide employment. So not all industrial land should be returned to industrial use as well as having residential. It doesn't suit every single site. And I like to see more nuance in the way that the policy is applied, not least because of the health and safety of the residents that will be expected to live there. So, the B8 sector is essential infrastructure. There's no doubt in my mind about that. I'm also pretty sure that is overlooked by too many policymakers. And so, we need to raise it up the agenda of importance when planning new schemes.
So one of the solutions that are seen about is the beds and sheds policies of mixed use developments of industrial and residential. What do you think about that, and the sort of policy focus on maker spaces and workspace for SMEs? Do you think that's working?
when the concept of beds and sheds first arose, which is probably about 3 or 4 years ago now, and I welcomed it because I do understand the political pressure for housing. I do understand, the need for not losing any more industrial land. So much of it's been lost in London to residential development over the years. So I welcomed the policy initially. That is until I actually started having to work with it in practically. And what I found was that what it does is it puts the onus of creating industrial space into the hands of residential developers. So it applies to situations where residential developers are holding industrial land. It's usually and land that's not protected, or LSIS land. So LSIS is the locally significant industrial sites. And that to me, LSIS land is lost through the beds and sheds policy. It's lost to industrial occupiers. It no longer offers protection because residential developers will be allowed to put residential schemes on LSIS land. And what happens is that, and quite understandably, they don't want to put in proper industrial space, which serves, service providers. They don't want large commercial vehicles mixing with their residents. They want to sell their flats. And I can see why they want to have more vanilla use class E type space. So instead of putting back B2 and B8 space, they're putting back loads of use class E space. They have to put back as much space as they are taking away. So in a scheme where they're building, a few hundred flats, they're also putting in, hundreds of thousands of square feet of use class E space. And that to me is not the replacement of industrial space, because one of the key messages that I'd like to get across is that to planners and policymakers is that use class E is not industrial space, and it is not okay to take away B2 and B8, replace it with loads of use class E, then congratulate yourself for preserving industrial space, because that's simply not true. It's the emperor's new clothes. But this is something which it's not a criticism of residential developers at all. I completely understand why they want to do that. It's a criticism of the planning policy, whereby I would like to see more effort put into the thought of placing industrial space in the right sort of location, so that instead of putting it back into the same site, it's moved elsewhere. That you look in your borough or the wider borough, the London area, and decide which are the best places to site the industrial space. And by this I mean, B2 space is manufacturing. There's not a great deal of manufacturing in London, but what there is mainly food production. So this is space which is inappropriate to put into residential schemes, because there needs to be extraction, there's flues, there'll be smells generated, there'll be an awful lot of heavy goods vehicle movements. So none of that's really appropriate for residential, but actually it's an essential service. We need it, and it has to go somewhere. It's got to be close to its market. Now, we hear a lot about last mile deliveries, and what I say about that is it doesn't just apply to parcel delivery. It applies to every industrial occupier, because the only reason they want to be in London is to be close to their market. And that's what last mile really means. It's proximity to where you do your business. And that applies to everyone. It applies to the laundries, it applies to the food producers, it applies to, service providers like lift engineers and heating engineers. We don't want our lift engineers, when you're stuck in the lift, having to trot in from somewhere in Essex because they can't have space close enough to where they operate, because they've been driven out. So the maker space is not good enough for those sort of occupiers, and therefore there needs to be proper planning to replace the B2 and B8 space that's being lost. So no longer categorise use class E with B2 and B8, and put it into, it has its own class, and it's not industrial space. So the mixed use beds and sheds, there are very few of them where they are mixing B8 with residential, and that's because there has to be certain characteristics in the site that allow it to mix well. And the first one being that there has to be more than one elevation, whereby the access for the industrial users can be completely separated from the residential. Without that basic characteristic in place, then there's going to be a bad outcome for both sectors. So I welcome it in certain situations. I welcome it where the design can work But that's not everywhere. And what I don't welcome is replacing B2 and B8 with use class E, and then sort of policymakers congratulating themselves about preserving industrial space when it's not true.
Of course, changes in values in recent years have altered that the relationship between housing land and industrial land. What has been the impact of that on your market?
It's interesting, this one, because this is something which I think a lot of people are not aware of, that the industrial land values are now the highest commercial sector in Greater London. You know, that I think a industrial developer competing with maybe an office developer in the city would struggle, but you know, in the Greater London area, there are sites that are coming up now which are office parks, and they're being purchased by industrial developers for redevelopment into sheds. So because they've got the purchasing power now. We've lost so much industrial land. Rents have risen to a level that allows developers to have the purchasing power to go out and outbid residential developers for sites as well. There's a site I can think of in Alperton, which was being chased by residential and industrial developers, and it was the industrial developers who paid most for it, for a pure industrial scheme with no residential. So there's a lot of ELSIS land that's been maybe master planned for residential, and if it's not already in the hands of a residential developer, I think it's going to be difficult for the planning policy to follow through on some of those sites, because industrial landowners are looking at their industrial schemes and thinking, well, you know, this is worth more as an industrial asset now than it ever will be as a residential site. Therefore, I'm not going to sell it to a residential developer because I haven't got the purchasing power to buy it anymore. And that actually means the policy will come to a stalemate. So there's areas of London where I can think that the planners that have, you know, are plotting for lots and lots of residential, and actually it's going to be difficult for those resi developers to acquire those sites in order to do that. So then, you know, there is a solution to this. You know, that there's been a bit of an age-old sort of confrontation between industrial land versus residential developers. But I think now that the purchasing power of the industrial developers such that they can go out and buy other assets now. So they can buy retail parks, and they can say buy office, they can buy hotels, you know, with large car parks, and they can use that land for industrial development, provided, of course, that the planners and the policymakers allow it to happen, and they can see that as a bit of a release valve, so they don't have to put industrial space back into residential schemes where it's inappropriate, because actually, you know, we've got the purchasing power to move elsewhere now, and that will be a better outcome. So I think it's positive news, and you know, we need more industrial supply, and you know, we've got a crisis now with rents rising for occupiers, and it's definitely a supply side issue.
So these are big sites you need, though. So can you tell me a few of the places in London there would be? I suppose difficult to get it into the central activity zone, but what sort of other areas would you see these located in?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of sites I can think of that are 13 acres each. There's one in East London on the market at the moment, which will probably be bought by industrial developers. And there's one over in Wembley at the moment, which is 12 acres, which will be bought by an industrial developer probably. So, you know, these sites, they do come up. There's also what we haven't discussed is intensification. So when a site of, say, for example, 5 acres comes up, and it's in an area where the rents and the values can sustain the development, because it's a very expensive development, we can build the multi-storey industrial schemes. And by this I mean the sort of multi-storey schemes where there are elevated yards, where there are like car park ramps, but for articulated lorries that can drive up to a yard and back up to a loading door in a very traditional way, except that they're using ramps. So that sort of industrial intensification can work in some areas where the rents are high enough. And for that, you need a site of about 5 or so acres, and that's possible. They do come up, especially if you're going to be buying, for example, you know, a business park. that's slightly out of town, or a retail park. Because most of the out-of-town business parks and most of the out-of-town retail parks are all built on former industrial land. So when they were a thing of the 1980s, you know, we were losing industrial land back then to other commercial uses, not necessarily just residential. So it's a return to those. But, you know, not every one of them is in a suitable location. You know, for example, I wouldn't advocate the canal network for a new industrial scheme, because there may have been former industrial schemes on that, but not now. But, you know, we need good road access. And there are sites which are coming up, and, you know, Savills is selling a site in Weybridge at the moment, which is a business park. And that's all the interest is from industrial developers. You know, the industrial sector bought a retail park in Mill Hill. Amazon bought the retail park up there that had planning consent for residential. Right now, we work very closely with our residential lands team, and we always make an assessment for our clients. We check, you know, is this worth more as industrial than it would be as a residential scheme? Constantly do that comparison. Sometimes it's marginal, and sometimes one will clearly outweigh the other. But at the moment, more and more, the industrial land is coming forward as being more valuable. Tends to be in greater London locations where densities for residential is not quite so high. So if you can put a tower block on your site, then the industrial land value won't be able to come up to it. But if there are any constraints on density for residential, then our land value is very likely to be more than that. So it means a change in landscape for London. So it's an exciting time. We just need to have the policymakers on board. And I am lobbying our sector to help the planners and policymakers understand it better. You know, we've got some sophisticated developers who have it in their gift, maybe to do some training for planners to understand why it's so necessary, because, you know, it's not the fault of the people who work in planning authorities. You know, they're just not familiar with our sector, and that's something that we can do something about.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating insights into the sort of fast changing nature of infrastructure in London. So thank you, Bridget. Thank you.
No, well, thank you for asking me on, Peter. It's my pleasure.